Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la primera experiencia digital de CASA SEAT. En unos instantes tendremos la oportunidad de escuchar la conferencia de John Moavenzadeh, director de Movilidad Urbana del MIT. Esta charla será íntegramente en inglés. Al final de su intervención habrá un turno de preguntas y respuestas. Si tenéis cualquier cuestión para él, podéis enviárnosla a través del chat disponible en la página del streaming en YouTube o a través de un mensaje directo en el perfil de CASA SEAT en Instagram. Si quieres conocer la programación de CASA SEAT, visita nuestra página web casa.seat e inscríbete en nuestro newsletter. Y sin más dilación, cambiamos al inglés. We switch to English. Please let me introduce the director of CASA SEAT, Gabriele Palma.
Dear friends and colleagues, good evening everybody, and welcome to the first online activity of CASA SEAT. Dear friends and colleagues, good evening everybody, and welcome to the first online activity of CASA SEAT. I am Gabriele Palma, the director of CASA SEAT, and today we have as a keynote guest speaker, John Moavenzadeh. But before introducing John, please let me explain briefly the goals of CASA SEAT and why we are online today. CASA SEAT is a tribute to Barcelona. It was conceived by SEAT, who was actually born in this city 70 years ago. It's a tribute to this city. And we say that CASA SEAT is the place where the city moves. In the space that we have created, we want to share innovative and relevant activities connected to the future of mobility, but also to sustainability, to innovation, to entrepreneurship, and to urban culture. The opening of CASA SEAT was planned on April 23rd. It's a special day in Barcelona. It is dedicated to St. George. It's an event colorful and pleasant. Thousands of citizens walk in the streets, buying and offering books and roses. But due to the COVID-19 outbreak, we had to postpone the official opening. And the streets today are empty, not only in Barcelona, but in many cities in the world. Therefore, we wanted to keep, in any case, our promise, and we decided to open our doors, at least digitally. So, on April 23rd, we launched the casa.seat website, and we started with digital activation, which represent a teaser to the contents that we will actually share also physically within the space of CASA SEAT. And today is the first digital session. We will talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the future of global urban mobility. And John Moavenzadeh, Director of Urban Mobility at the Boston MIT, will talk about this fascinating theme. I'm really keen to learn from the innovative talks of John, who is one of the most inspiring experts regarding the future of mobility. And I also invite you to raise your questions, because at the end, then I will be able to share your questions with John, maybe not all of them, and then John will kindly answer to them. Welcome, John. How are you?
Thank you. Very good. How are you, Gabriele?
Very well, and really excited to listen to you. John,
well,
please
go ahead.
Before leaving to you the words, please let me go through your impressive curriculum, because I went through and I have selected a few lines. And so today, John is the Executive Director for Urban Mobility, Professional Education at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's also Senior Advisor to Deloitte Future of Mobility Practice, and he's also venture partner with Rich Lane Limited Partners. He's also founder and managing partner at Mobility Nexus LLC, where he cooperates with several companies aiming to transform transportation. When we go to the education, John holds a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the Carnegie Mellon University, as Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Michigan, and Master of Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School, and many others. So I'm really, really impressed. But I think that one can say that John actually started his career in the automotive as engineer of product design. And after a few years, he was already director in the World Economic Forum, first in Geneva and then in New York, working on autonomous vehicles and urban mobility, security of international travel systems, drones, future of the airspace. And therefore, with this track, you can imagine that John is really a frequent keynote speaker. That's why it's really a true privilege to have together John with us. So, dear John, I just remind you that this session will be recorded and will then available on our website, and I leave you to you the screen and the word. Thank you very much for staying with us.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Gabriele. It's a great pleasure to be here today to help to celebrate the opening of CASA SEAT. I think as the topic of the discussion is the impact of COVID-19 on the future of mobility, I think it's first important to just say that this has been such a difficult time, and to express my sympathies. In the United States, we've been watching very carefully what has been happening in Spain, in Italy, in other parts of the world, and in many ways that's happening here right now. So it is a challenging topic to talk about. Let me share a few slides with you to get the discussion going. I think I want to just start by stating that there is so much uncertainty related to COVID-19 that it is nearly impossible to predict the future. And that is not at all my goal with this talk. My goal is to offer a framework to think about how the future could unfold. So let's start with just the concept of how the virus will impact the future of mobility. It can roughly be broken into two categories. One is elastic resilience, which is to say that things will eventually bounce back. Things will return to normal. It will take some time, but we will get back to normal, perhaps even overshooting when we think about the pent-up demand that exists. How many of us are eager to take a vacation holiday to the beach, to the island? How many of us are eager to go to our favorite restaurant or meet our friends? So we know that there will be this kind of elasticity in the response, but of course it could take a very long time. But then there's the side that's really a fundamental and structural change. And this is driven by changing our behavior. So our habits will be reshaped as we all live through the effects that we're living through today with this virus. Now, if we look back 100 years and we think about the deadliest of the viruses, the global influenza pandemic of 1918, this chart shows what the shape of the death curve looked like in the United States. And as you can see, there are three waves. March 1918 was the first wave, but by the fall 1918, a second wave hit that was far deadlier than the first wave. And I think it's very important to think about, what the shape of the coronavirus curve could actually look like. Will it be a sort of clearly defined peak curve, or will it be a more what I would call a snake curve, where there are second and third waves that are perhaps even more lethal than the first wave? And when we think in that context, the more likely we are to live through a peak curve, the more of the response I think will be that elastic resilience. However, the more prolonged the impact of the virus on health and on our social fabric, then we will start to see some of those fundamental behavioral changes, which will induce structural changes for the future of mobility. So if we look at this through the classic 5 lenses of scenario planning, economic lens, social lens, political, environmental, and technology, and we ask what does COVID-19 mean? Well, clearly we're seeing just a tremendous catastrophic effects on the economic and financial side. Tremendous amounts of personal debt, government debt, business debt, high levels of unemployment, recession. Just yesterday in the United States, the first quarter GDP results were in with negative 4.8%, which is really the highest that we've seen in this country since the economic crisis of 2008. But I think perhaps more sobering, some of the government officials are stating that the second quarter will be far worse. And that brings us to levels that we've seen going back to the Great Depression of the late 20s and the 1930s. So very sobering indeed. In terms of the social impact, obviously social distancing has a profound impact on mobility, the levels of stress and isolation that people feel, our newfound comfort with engaging in digital media. On the political front, we see tension, a sort of polarization between those that suggest that the health and welfare of people should come first, and those that perhaps take a practical approach to say, yes, but we also need to look at the significance of the economy and jobs. I think we see impacts on the sort of the national focus and perhaps some elements of reverse globalization that I'll talk about in a little bit. Some positive environmental effects that we've seen in terms of global emissions from the virus. And on the technology side, certainly, I mean, moving forward with advanced digital platforms, and I think as well relevant for mobility, robotics, and autonomy. So what does this actually mean for mobility? Well, fundamentally on the economic side, it reduces the demand for mobility. And we know that people consume mobility related to their level of personal income. It's very clear that wealthier individuals consume more passenger kilometers and wealthier countries consume more passenger kilometers. So clearly we will see a shift. Interestingly, by the way, across different cultures, across different parts of the world, people do tend to have a relatively constant mobility time budget. That is to say that we usually are willing to spend about 2 hours each day moving. And of course, what happens is as we get wealthier, more of that budget is allocated to faster forms of movement, particularly international air travel. So clearly a big impact on the reduction in demand for mobility. Clearly social distancing is just, a perfect storm, a double disaster for so much of the global transportation system. When you think about our trains and our subway systems and our airports, they are by definition crowded spaces, and the business model for many of the companies that operate these systems is dependent on a high load factor, meaning you want to make sure that all the seats are filled. So it's tremendous sort of negative impact as well for the many of the companies that operate mobility systems. I'll talk a little bit more about sort of the concept of the new office, or even how cities could look different in the future, some potential structural changes brought on by COVID-19, localization of supply chains I referenced already, and a bit more about autonomous and freight delivery systems. I think it's important to take a big step back if we're going to talk about personal mobility and ask the question, why do people move in the first place? Because in many ways, mobility in itself doesn't matter. It's the access that mobility affords. It's getting people what they need that matters. So it's access to healthcare. It's being able to get to work. We call that commuting. We have a special name for that form of mobility. Being able to educate ourselves, for our children to get to school, for adults to continue their professional education, the need to meet, the need to get things, the need to eat, and of course the need to enjoy ourselves. And if we think about, so where are the places that we move to achieve those objectives? It's a diverse group that we are all very, very familiar with. And in all of these will be impacted by the COVID-19. All of these institutions, all of these sort of the ways that we're typically accustomed to engaging with a retail store, or certainly the future of the workplace, we can anticipate some structural changes in those areas. Here in the United States, Instacart is one of the delivery providers of groceries. Some data came out indicating that they had over $1 billion in sales for the first 2 weeks of April. That's up 450% compared to December. This platform that we're all using right now, Zoom, saw nearly 400% growth more than a month ago. So we can only imagine what it is today. And the reason all of this is important is because, getting back to what the social psychologists tell us about how behavior changes, there's been many, many studies about how long does it take for a habit to be formed. The traditional literature said 21 days. Some new literature and research into this area indicated that it takes on average about 66 days, and as long as 250 days to really fundamentally alter our habits, alter our behavior. And that's what's happening right now as we live through the coronavirus. We are learning new ways of interacting with our colleagues at the office. We are learning, our children are learning new ways of learning through their school system, through digital platforms, and so forth. But my main message with this way of looking at it is, we cannot ask the question, what is the future of mobility, first, without first asking, what is the future of the office, of the workforce? What is the future of retail? What is the future for places of worship? How will those institutions change with the COVID-19? And then, of course, mobility will follow in many ways from that. So with that as a sort of conceptual framework, I could anticipate 9 specific impacts of COVID-19 on the future of mobility, and one, what I'll call a sort of wild card. So just to briefly run through these, and I'll go into more detail, I can foresee that COVID-19 will certainly have a massive hit to public transportation, already has. Very strong headwinds for the concept of shared mobility. Tourism way down, but potentially recovering with time. Business travel way down, recovering, but perhaps not to pre-COVID levels. Automotive sales way down, but with opposing forces on the personal use automobile. Capital constraints, testing requirements, delaying the progression with advanced mobility technology, things like autonomous driving, etc. On the goods mobility side, disaggregation of global supply chains, perhaps the rise of sidewalk robotics and last mile automation. And I would speculate an acceleration in autonomous long haul trucking as well. The wild card in all of this, which I'll talk about last, is a reversal of the long-term trend of people moving into cities. So let's start with public transportation. If we look at 10 major cities around the world, these are data from a popular app. So it's not the actual ridership data, but it's a very good proxy for that data. And if we look at essentially public transportation usage from January 15th of this year to earlier this week, we see some very precipitous declines. In Barcelona, 82% down from January 15th. In Madrid, 88% down. In New York, 74% down. In Tokyo, 90% down. Now, this is a very disturbing picture for public transportation agencies because their finances were strained already to begin with. This is data from public transit agencies across the US, basically showing that all of them lose money, but the larger systems lose less money in general than the smaller systems. Farebox accounts for only about a third of the actual operating costs for most public transport systems here in the US. So they were in trouble to begin with, and now COVID-19 will have, just a much deeper impact with potentially some long-term effects. There is a consultancy in the United Kingdom called Sistra that conducted a survey. I think they asked around 15 or 1,600 people to anticipate their behavior after transport restrictions are lifted. And 20% said that they sense that they'll be making fewer trips on public transport after restrictions are lifted. This number may be even higher today than when the survey was conducted. But interestingly, of those who said they expect to make fewer trips, about half of them said because, hey, I don't want to get sick. About a quarter of them said, I'll be working from home. And about 14% of them said, I'm anticipating another way to make my journey. And it's this 24 and 14% that points to a potential structural change that could be that could exacerbate the oncoming crisis in public transportation. Having said all of this, it is absolutely clear that public transport is absolutely a vital component for how people can get around in cities. There was talk a few years back of, this great hope for autonomous robo-taxis and that, public transport would no longer be needed. And I completely reject that notion. Anyone who thinks that you can take the entire population of the London Tube and bring them up to the surface and put them into autonomous pods and think that you'll have a better mobility solution, I would suggest is woefully incorrect. Now, let's talk about sort of shared mobility. In the sort of, pre-COVID world, you could say that, the future of urban mobility, of how we get around in cities, really comes down to these 7 important words, and that a tremendous amount of value could be created with the combination of autonomous, shared, and integrated mobility systems, meaning autonomous vehicles that have far more than one occupant. In fact, probably don't look too much like personal use automobiles. They may look like small shuttles, and which are integrated with the public transportation systems and other transport networks in a kind of seamless way. In many ways, this is and continues to be the holy grail of mobility. But the shared part of that is such an important component. And in the age of COVID-19, shared mobility all of a sudden has a very different meaning to all of us. So very strong, I think, headwinds for this kind of key component of the future of mobility. Just a word on, Uber, and this traditional rideshare is generally not shared, Didi, Uber, Lyft, etc. Most of those trips are single passenger trips, but similarly with the virus, we've seen precipitous declines in rideshare usage. This is proxy data for Uber rides on a worldwide basis. Turning over to air travel. These are what are called revenue passenger kilometers. This is data from IATA, the International Air Transport Association. This is for their latest data publication from February. Their March publication should be coming out any day now, which will show an even more steep decline, a plummeting of air transport in this part of the curve. And so the question is, what does this mean for air travel moving forward? Well, we do have a precedent to a catastrophic event that certainly had a tremendous shock on global air travel. Even looking at data on air travel within the United States, we see that it took about almost 3 years for air travel in the United States to recover to pre-9/11 levels after the event. And so we can perhaps map some of that onto COVID and to anticipate that it will take some time for tourists to come back. Obviously, Spain is, one of the world's most important tourist destinations, one of the highest destinations for tourism. To what degree can we expect a drop in international tourists to Spain? I would say quite significant in the near term, but the good news is that it's likely to recover with some time, and as people's economic ability, obviously tourism is discretionary spending, as that recovers, then we can expect the tourists will eventually come back. On the business travel side, I also a recovery, but I do anticipate that we will see some permanent substitution and some practical, do we really need to make that trip? Can we just conduct the meeting or a series of meetings via Zoom or some other digital platform? Switching gears to the personal use automobile, we can see two sort of opposing forces. I mean, on the one hand, new cars in particular are very expensive, and in today's environment, we will see a significant decline in automotive sales. I expect the second quarter global automotive sales data to be just terrible this year. We see also, getting back to the demand patterns of mobility, people who have lost their job have less need certainly for a new car. The tailwinds is that the traditional personal use automobile, there was this song in the 1980s that said, "Here in my car, I feel safest of all. It's the only place to be." And there is this notion that a car is a kind of protected personal space. And in the era of coronavirus, that could be a positive force for automotive sales, perhaps more so for used automotive sales than new car sales. Temporarily, we're seeing lower fuel and insurance costs, and then long term, there's this wild card of reverse urbanization, which I'll talk about. But let me just take one step back here, and to all my friends at SEAT, as Gabriela mentioned, I started my career as an automotive engineer, and I'm very passionate about automobiles, and certainly SEAT builds some beautiful automobiles. But we have to take a step back and ask, to what degree the personal use automobile is the right solution for cities. And, increasingly, I think this is coming into question. Automobiles typically weigh 10 to 20 times the weight of the people that they are carrying. They sit idle for 95% of the time. It's an expensive and underutilized asset. They tend to be designed for the extreme use case. So we might get a bigger vehicle for the few times that we take the family vacation, or we might get four-wheel drive for the few times that we get snow in the winter. And they take up a very large footprint on city streets. And that is a very precious public asset that could be utilized more efficiently. And I think cities are very much increasingly starting to view it as such. So fortunately, we've seen automakers very much shifting from, how can we make better cars to sort of how can we be part of this urban mobility solution. And I think it is a credit to, to SEAT, to Gabriele and his team for opening an institution like CASA SEAT, where you can actually engage with people and the people of Barcelona and say, what do you think? Moving on to some of the more capital-intensive technologies, things like urban air mobility, autonomous vehicles. The point of this slide is to say that these things are very costly ventures. This is a dated data stream, but showing that venture capital investment in autonomous vehicles peaked at over $10 billion in 2018. That's venture capital. This is not taking into the very deep corporate pockets. Obviously the big automakers are all very much invested in this technology, and Waymo and Tesla and other players. So the point is that it costs a lot of money, and we are entering more of a capital constrained world. The testing, we still have a need for test driver, and the virus presents some complexity for that. I think long-term, I'm still very much optimistic and even bullish on all of these technologies, but I can imagine a kind of a delay or setback. And actually, I think just earlier this week, Ford announced that they would be delaying their autonomous program by at least a year. Just to switch gears a little bit into goods mobility. We've talked a lot about the movement of people. Now let's talk about the movement of goods. In this country, in the United States, it was somewhat of a national embarrassment when we realized we don't have enough face masks and actually have to import these products from China and from other locations. When we realized that so many of our pharmaceuticals are sourced in China and India and other locations. And I do think that there has been a sort of awareness of the complexity of global supply chains over the past 2 months that most of us hadn't necessarily considered earlier. And we could see some longer term structural repercussions of that in a movement toward more localized supply chains or more nationally sufficient supply chains. This is a picture of a Silicon Valley company, Neuro, that is producing these sidewalk delivery robots, and maybe this is really the golden age for a company like this, where it seems like a ideally suited solution for these difficult times with the virus. And finally, I would speculate that we actually see an acceleration toward long-haul autonomous trucking, not necessarily like what you see in this picture. This is a product from Volvo, but more of a traditional looking vehicle with a cab, with the steering wheel and pedals, and being able to be driven as well as to be in autonomous mode. It seems like we could see some movement in that direction. This may be localized to the United States, but there is a severe shortage of particularly long-haul drivers here. And this could be a moment to accelerate the development of that technology, with the same caveat that this is very capital intensive and requires extensive testing and so forth. So those are 9 impacts on the future of mobility. Just to close out, I'd like to talk a little bit about the wild card, which is reverse urbanization, which is the concept that actually cities become less desirable to live in a sort of protracted age of viral contagion. And the pre-COVID view is really that urbanization is one of the fundamental drivers of mobility. People who live in cities tend to be wealthier. As I said before, people who are wealthier tend to consume more mobility. And so it's a driver of demand. If we see a reversal of that trend, which I'm not suggesting is likely, but I am suggesting that if it were to happen, it would be significant. As people in an economically constrained time, living in many cities is very expensive for housing. They may wish to reconsider that equation. Businesses, many of whom have been operating very productively during the crisis, may say, why do we have that expensive office downtown? We may potentially see some of that effect, which would be, I think, in many ways, a real game changer for the future of mobility. And that's what's indicated here with, as we talked about before, the sort of the potentially structural effects of shifting consumers and the new technology. So that's I think very sufficient to sort of start the dialogue. These are a few ideas. I thank you very much, and now I would welcome any questions that anyone may have. And back to you, Gabriele.
Thank you very much, John. It was really, really, really inspiring and interesting, and thanks for that. I guess that also our panel has been fascinated by your comments and thoughts. We have actually a few questions, quite a few questions, and I will start with the first one. So you mentioned that the effect of the COVID-19 will not only be on the mobility of people, but also on the mobility of goods. Do you believe that the changes that we are going to face, we can also affect or become even an obstacle to free trade?
I think it's an excellent question. I do, in that we very unfortunately, I guess an unfortunate element of human nature is sometimes what you could call an us versus them mentality. And when we're under stress and we feel threatened by this sort of mysterious health enemy, sometimes people have a tendency to go into that mode. And with that comes restrictions on trade, on immigration, on interaction with people who are outside of your tribe. So I would suggest that yes, we could expect to see some of that, increase in protectionism, trade protectionism, moving forward. And I also, as I talked before, I also see on the demand side more of a focus, or at least a recognition that there's certain things that probably countries should in fact be able to produce on their own without being reliant on others. Now, clearly, I think it's a different discussion when you're talking within Europe and you have a very strong functioning economic bloc with the European Union. So I would suggest maybe there the concept is more Europe versus rest of world. But I think in the United States, we're certainly seeing, regrettably, I think some pressures in that direction.
Well, it's not really encouraging, but I think it's important at least to be prepared and to know about this. This also reminds me one of the comments that you have done about how the COVID will create, the COVID effect will create some rejection also to the globalization point of view, you know, the pressure. So, but at the same time, I think there is a little bit of contradiction on the fact that we also learned that, at least in terms of virus, there is no barriers. So it's something that's at the end of the day, we are sharing the same world. So I mean, we will possibly live to different tendencies together. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's certainly there's so much encouraging and hopeful reason for hope that's come from our response to the virus that I wouldn't want to overshadow that with the negative. And we have seen tremendous examples of scientists that are collaborating on, you know, on a global basis. I mean, this is really, you know, the hunt for the vaccine is perhaps one of the greatest coordinated scientific endeavors ever undertaken by humanity, and that's very encouraging and very impressive. So I don't want to lose sight of that as well.
Cool, thank you very much. Another question. How governments can create value in these emerging environments is one of our public asking.
How can
governments really help in this situation and create a value in this environment, also regarding mobility?
You know, there's been so much discussion about the role of government during the pandemic, and you know, many folks have said that the role of government, first and foremost, is to protect their citizens, and so that means, you know, protecting from something like COVID-19. And you know, I think everywhere around the world we've seen governments. Well, maybe not everywhere, but we've seen governments that are really, you know, certainly trying to do the best job that they can. And I do think when you know, and it's not necessarily the head of state, right? I mean, here in the United States, we've had a number of state governors who have been very proactive, engaging with their people in their state and really on a national basis and being part of the national conversation as well. That I think, you know, it's been helpful to have that type of guidance coming from, you know, from the state government level, as well as the role of the federal government. So to the question of how can governments create value, I think that they can instruct, you know, their people based on the best scientific knowledge. This is what we know. This is how you can stay safe. You know, that's the primary objective. Then, of course, we get into the economic stimulus, and you know, there is a role for government there, right? In times of extreme crisis, for a government to step in and to actually start spending. And I know that that's deficit spending, debt spending, and so forth. But you know, there's, I guess, in the economic literature, there is a compelling precedent for when that set of policies has been effective in the past. So I think when that's done right, government can also play a very important role in terms of helping people to really manage through the devastating economic repercussions of this crisis.
And do you also think that some agreements or some cooperation between different governments can help? I mean, for example, in the identification of data models shared in order at least to speak the same language in terms of numbers, evaluation, and researches.
Yes, absolutely. I absolutely do. And I also think, I'm not a health expert by training in any capacity, but I think even this type of international collaboration that we're having right now can be helpful to hear perspectives, because people in mobility are certainly asking this question all around the world right now. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for the future? So I think to the extent that we can continue to engage in that sort of dialogue at a global level, I absolutely believe that that's completely that's critical.
There is another, thank you very much, John. There is another question regarding the tourism sector.
Yeah.
Tourism is one of the main business in Spain and also in other countries. Now passenger mobility is essential for the development. So how do you think this sector will evolve after the coronavirus outbreak, and what measures would you recommend to ensure the survival of passenger transport companies? I think it's a big question.
Yeah, it is a big question. And again, we can't think about the answer to that question without thinking about the shape of the virus curve and how that evolves. In the optimistic scenario where we reach a defined peak, and now we see a clear downward curve of infections and deaths, I think that's certainly a much better scenario in terms of the recovery for tourism. If we see prolonged curves, I do think that it could be a long time, and I do think that there will be there could be some airlines and some hospitality companies and so forth that cannot weather such a long storm, and will need to go under, which is quite sad. But personally, I don't see a way around that. I mean, I think that there is opportunity for governments to step in. The World Travel and Tourism Council has been very vocal in terms of emphasizing the importance of travel and tourism for the global economy. Roughly 10% of global GDP and just millions of jobs around the world, and particularly some jobs for lower income individuals for example, in hotel cleaning services and so forth, but very important industry in many countries. In some countries, the primary industry. So there is this message to say, governments need to step in. And I agree with that. But I will also, with the caveat that message is coming from perhaps every other industry sector out there, everything, ranging from food production and agriculture to other forms of transportation and so forth. So governments obviously operate with limited resources, and they'll have to balance the needs as best they can.
Thank you very much. Another question. Are you tired?
Yeah.
That's all right? Can we go ahead? Good. One question is, will this situation help or accelerate the electric cars' upcoming trends?
I think that's a great question. And I have to say, you may have noticed significantly absent from my presentation was the environmental impact. My view is that it will likely, in the short term, set back and delay the adoption of electric vehicles, because many electric vehicles are still operating with a significant price premium over petrol operated vehicles. But I think I'm a big believer in the future of electric vehicles. And if anything, maybe it's a little bit like the autonomous question. It's a setback, it's a delay, but ultimately we will still get there.
Cool. Another question. Thank you very much. Do you think that technology can play a major role in order to ensure social distancing, for example, geolocalization, or to manage mobility flows, and in which way?
I do think technology can play a very important role. I think we're all very conscious of the privacy implications of such technology, and wary of who may have access to data about where we are and who we have been in contact with. There are many sensitivities around that. But if we can figure out a way to balance that equation, I do think that there is a strong role for technology to play. And we've seen this, in several countries, programs about sort of apps for contact tracing of individuals and so forth, that I think I lean personally toward that, because I think the big question we have to address first is to understand the virus, to understand the spread of the virus, and to measure. We can't manage what we can't measure. So I'm a big believer in gathering as much data as we can, and hopefully we do that in a way that doesn't blatantly violate people's personal privacy.
Thank you very much. John, this is the last question. We don't want to take too much profit of your availability, but I think it's also interesting. So the question is, how do you think that the urban mobility network and systems will evolve after the coronavirus?
That which mobility network?
The new urban mobility network.
New urban mobility. Yeah. Well, all of this is grounded in that big question about how will, what's the future looking like for cities? And again, I think it's a low probability that we will see a reversal of this long-term urbanization trend that we have witnessed. But if that were to happen, it would have very significant impact on all of these new urban mobility models. For me, the greatest concerning part is a little bit to what I alluded to in my talk, which is about the pressure on shared mobility. I absolutely believe that the solution to the congestion that we saw before this crisis in so many of our cities around the world, it requires a shared vehicle sharing component, where we have to see some sort of a shift, certainly in the urban cores, some sort of a shift away from personal use vehicle and into maybe larger vehicles with several passengers. I'm not necessarily talking about putting city buses everywhere, but maybe improving the bus network and integrating it with these shuttle type vehicles. And I think, that depending on what the virus means for cities, and if we assume that cities will continue to evolve the same way, I don't think that, that investment will go away permanently. Again, it depends on what the shape of the curve looks like. But for me, it's a very important component of the solution, the shared mobility component.
Thank you very much. That's also very, very helpful, because I think it's one of the streams of work that many companies are now following. There is actually a little bit of concern about a short-term reaction by the public to the idea of sharing something,
Yeah.
But maybe that is hopefully will change in a while. Now, this was actually the last question. So thank you very much, John. It was really, really interesting and inspiring to me, and I hope the same for the public. And I just want to thank also to the public, because actually also the number of viewers increased during the conversation, which is also very, very encouraging to me, and also means that it was actually very interesting. So I also want to thank all the people invited, who was involved in the organization of this conversation, because I think that in terms of organization, everything was working well. This is a live conversation. It was a challenge at the beginning, but I think we made it. And I also would like to invite the public just to remember that we will go ahead with such a kind of conversation on digital platforms. And we will have also a date. It's on the 5th of May. It will be at 6:30 p.m., same time. And we will talk about what are the challenges of launching a new company in this very special situation. We will also count on the contribution by Javier Jimenez, who is the CEO of Lanzadera, Eneco Knorr, who is the founder and CEO in several successful startup accelerators in Spain. And the meeting will be moderated by Alejandro Vesga, who is the director of the magazine Emprendedores. Now, having said that, I want just to repeat a really, really big thank to John, to your time, to your words, and to your efforts in order to give us your view about the future of mobility. So,
and thank you for inviting me, Gabriela. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a ti, John. So thanks for all of you. Stay safe at home, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.